Richard Sterling, was 62 years old when he finally encountered the one immovable object in a universe he believed he owned. He realized that the continuation of his own life was not available for purchase. He realized it on a Tuesday morning in late November, inside the sterile, aggressively fluorescent-lit consultation room of Memorial Hospital's Advanced Neurology Wing. I know the exact time the realization hit him because I was standing in the hallway, looking at my phone when the text arrived. It was exactly 8:15 a.m. My father was a man who had organized his entire 62 years on Earth around the relentless accumulation of leverage. He built his empire in commercial real estate. He acquired buildings that were failing. He restructured the human lives operating inside them, using dispassionate spreadsheets, and he sold them for a massive profit. He used that profit to buy larger buildings, to restructure more lives, and to insulate himself from the unpredictable messiness of the world. He did not have conversations with people. He had negotiations. Everyone was a variable. Everyone was a potential acquisition or a calculated loss. And he had spent the first 26 years of my life negotiating my future with the exact same detached, calculating precision he applied to a multi-million-dollar zoning permit. I was his only daughter. In the cold, magnificent architecture of my father's worldview, an only daughter was an asset, and high-value assets were meant to be merged, at the strategically appropriate time, with other assets of equal or greater value to solidify the empire. He already had the merger planned. He had the junior partner selected. And then, at 26, I derailed the spreadsheet. I introduced him to Julian. Julian, who was merely in the second grueling year of a surgical residency. Julian, who drove a 12-year-old Honda Civic that made a distinct, concerning rattling sound when it idled at red lights. Julian, who had hands that never shook and a mind that processed complex neurological systems with quiet, terrifying brilliance, but who possessed a last name that meant absolutely nothing in my father's exclusive country club. Julian, whose parents ran a small, flour-dusted bakery in Queens. My father had looked at Julian across our 20-foot mahogany dining table, and he had decided, in approximately 4 seconds, that Julian was a severe liability. He had absolutely no idea, on that crisp evening 6 years ago, that the liability sitting across from him, quietly eating pot roast, would eventually grow up to be the only man on the entire eastern seaboard capable of opening my father's skull and carefully, painstakingly, evicting the death that was growing inside it. Before I tell you exactly what happened when the heavy wooden door to consultation room 3 opened, and my father saw exactly who was holding his terminal MRI results, I need to pause and ask you something. I want you to think about the people who were supposed to protect you. If those people looked at the person you loved, the person who made you feel safe, and told you that you had to choose between the family you came from and the family you were trying to build, what would you actually do? Would you try to negotiate a compromise? Would you spend years twisting yourself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to make them understand, knowing deep down they had already decided they never would? Or would you do what Julian did when my father slid a check with 5 zeros across a leather desk and told him to walk away? Would you sit very still, look at the money, look at the man offering it, and realize with absolute clarity that some games can only be won by refusing to sit at the board? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I know how heavy these choices are. And if this story is already finding a quiet place inside you, if you have ever had to pack up your bags and walk away from a dinner table where love was treated as a transaction just to protect the person you were becoming, please like this video and subscribe. New stories arrive here regularly, and every one of them is designed to remind you that you are not crazy and you are not alone. Before we go deeper, tell me, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Let me take you back to the beginning. Because the suffocating silence that fell over consultation room 3 at 8:15 a.m. on that Tuesday didn't just fall out of the sky. It was constructed. It was built from 6 years of a specific weaponized absence. An absence that my parents meticulously designed to break my spirit, and that ended up. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I am 32 years old, and my profession is architectural drafting. I build the digital skeletons of massive structures long before they ever become real. I organize space. I calculate load-bearing walls. I understand, at a fundamental mathematical level, exactly what is required to keep a massive structure from collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. I grew up in a structure that was constantly threatening to collapse unless everyone stood in their exact, assigned, rigid places. The house I was raised in had 32 massive windows and very little actual warmth. My mother, Margaret, was a woman who managed her profound internal anxiety through the aggressive, relentless curation of external appearances. She did not have friends. She had an audience. She did not have hobbies. She had social obligations that required the correct seasonal wardrobe and the right caterer. When I brought Julian home, it didn't just disrupt her curation. It shattered it. It wasn't simply that Julian was a medical resident buried under a mountain of student debt. It was that Julian was completely, peacefully unbothered by the things my family worshipped. He didn't know the difference between an oyster fork and a salad fork. And more importantly, he didn't pretend to care. He stepped into our sterile, museum-like home with the easy, unforced warmth of a man who had grown up in a house that smelled like yeast and melting sugar. A house where people spoke over each other, laughed loudly from their bellies, and loved without constantly measuring the return on investment. My parents didn't understand him. And in my father's world, what you do not understand, you fear. And because my father only knew how to manage fear through financial control, he tried to buy the problem away. The ultimatum happened on a Sunday evening after dinner. My father called Julian into his private study. It was a room specifically designed to intimidate, filled with first edition leather-bound books that had never been opened, and crystal decanters that were always perfectly full. I stood hidden in the hallway, holding my breath. My father didn't offer Julian a seat. He simply opened his heavy, leather-bound checkbook. He uncapped his fountain pen, and he wrote a number. A very large, life-altering number. $200,000. He tore the check out and slid it across the polished mahogany desk. "This is for your medical loans," my father said, his voice carrying the casual, absolute authority of a king. "And for your trouble. You're a smart boy, Julian. You know you don't belong in this house. Take the head start. Go open a practice somewhere quiet. And leave my daughter alone." Julian didn't gasp. He didn't yell. He didn't even look down at the check. He looked directly into my father's eyes. He possessed that specific quiet stillness that he would later use in the operating room when a major artery ruptured and everyone else was panicking. The stillness of someone who can instantly separate the noise from the actual problem. Julian said, "Keep your money, Mr. Sterling. The way you live, you're going to need it to keep you warm." Then he turned around and walked out of the study. He found me in the hallway, took my hand without saying a word, and we walked out the front door. We didn't know it at that exact moment, but we were leaving for 6 years. The retaliation was swift, absolute, and designed to cripple. My parents did not come to our wedding. They did not call. They did not send a gift or a card. What they did send was a formal, heavily legally phrased email, drafted by my mother but carrying my father's fingerprints. It stated that since I had chosen to align myself with a working-class mistake, I was choosing to step outside the protection of the Sterling family name. I was no longer welcome at family functions, holidays, or the estate. My father, ever the pragmatist, handled the logistics of my excommunication. He simply severed the financial arteries. He cut off my phone plan while I was in the middle of a call. He canceled my health insurance policies. He drained the trust fund that had been in my name since birth, exploiting a legal loophole he had specifically designed 30 years ago, just in case he ever needed to pull the parachute. He wanted me to feel the cold. He believed, with the absolute, unshakable conviction of a man who evaluates all human connection in fiscal quarters, that poverty would be my breaking point. That within a year, the weight of the real world would crush my romance. That I would realize love could not pay a mortgage or fix a broken transmission. And that I would come crawling back to his study, apologizing, ready to be reassigned to a more suitable, wealth-generating partner. But my father's math was fundamentally flawed. He had calculated my breaking point without ever factoring in the materials I was actually made of. I was a draftsperson. I knew how to build a foundation. I had my own income, It wasn't country club money, but it paid the rent. Julian finished his residency, surviving on black coffee and sheer willpower. Then he completed a brutal, highly selective neurosurgical fellowship. He didn't just become a neurosurgeon. He became obsessed with the impossible. He specialized in complex skull-based tumors, the rare, aggressive ones that wrapped around critical nerves, the ones that other veteran surgeons looked at, shook their heads, and said no. We built a life entirely outside the gravitational pull of my parents' wealth. We bought a small house with a porch that needed painting. We adopted a dog that shed far too much hair on our second-hand sofa. We drank cheap wine on Friday nights and laughed until our ribs ached. We were deeply, profoundly happy. We were happy in the quiet, invisible way of people who don't need an audience to prove that their lives have meaning. For 6 long years, I did not exist to Richard Sterling. Until the headaches started. It began as simple migraines. He blamed it on stress, on the markets. Then came the blurred vision in his right eye. Then, during a board meeting, the specific, terrifying loss of his peripheral sight. He knocked over a glass of water he couldn't see. The subsequent MRI revealed a monster, a glioblastoma, grade 4. It was wrapped intimately, aggressively, around the optic nerve and pressing perilously into the carotid artery. My father went to 3 of the most expensive, exclusive private neurologists on the East Coast. He offered them cash up front. He offered to endow entirely new wings in their hospitals. He tried to buy his survival. All 3 specialists looked at his scans, looked at his checkbook, and told him the exact same thing. It is inoperable. The tumor is too entangled. The risk of massive stroke or death on the table is simply too high. But the 3rd doctor, an older man who cared far more about biology than managing my father's massive ego, told him there was a sliver of a chance. There was one surgeon, a younger man, a pioneer of a radical new microsurgical technique, specifically designed for this exact impossible presentation. He handed my father a card with a name on it, Dr. Hayes. Here is the detail that made the collision inevitable. Julian had published all of his groundbreaking medical papers using his mother's maiden name, Hayes, as a quiet tribute to the woman who baked bread to put him through college. My parents had never cared enough to ask for his full legal name. To them, he was never a person. He was just Julian, the mistake. The appointment was made through Julian's surgical coordinator, under the name Richard Sterling. Julian saw 30 complex life-or-death cases a week. He didn't review the intake patient names until the morning of his clinic. He preferred to focus entirely on the raw data of the scans the night before, completely blind to the identity of the patient. When Julian finally saw the patient chart that Tuesday morning, he didn't call me in a panic. He didn't gloat. He didn't pace the room. He reviewed my father's MRI with the exact chilling clinical precision he brought to everything. He separated the biology from the biography. The tumor was incredibly real. The risk was incredibly massive. I was sitting at my drafting table at work when my phone vibrated. It was a text from Julian. Just 2 sentences. Your parents are in my waiting room. Room 3. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and left the office immediately. I didn't drive to the hospital with a plan for vengeance. I didn't want to gloat. I drove there with the sudden, heavy realization that the universe possesses a sense of irony far sharper than any surgical scalpel. I arrived at the clinic and walked down the quiet, sterile corridor. I stopped in the hallway just outside consultation room 3. The door was cracked open just an inch. I could see them. My father looked so much smaller than the giant of my childhood. The custom-tailored Italian suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. The aura of arrogance that usually preceded him into a room was completely gone, replaced by the specific, vibrating, naked terror of a man who has finally encountered a problem he cannot buy his way out of. My mother sat rigidly beside him. Her hands were clutched so tightly around a designer handbag that her knuckles were white. They were staring at the door, waiting for their savior, waiting for the renowned Dr. Hayes to walk in and tell them his money was good here. The door opened fully. Julian walked in. He was wearing his pristine white coat. He was holding an iPad displaying the complex 3D renderings of the MRI scans. His face was entirely, perfectly neutral. He stopped at the foot of the exam table and looked down. My father looked up. He looked at the face of the man he had thrown out of his study, the man he had tried to bribe like a common nuisance, the man he had deemed entirely, fundamentally worthless. My father went completely still. It wasn't the stillness of patience. It was the absolute, paralyzed stillness of a man realizing that the solid ground he thought he was standing on does not actually exist. My mother's mouth opened. She looked at Julian's face. Then her eyes darted to the embroidered blue letters on his white coat. Dr. Julian Hayes, head of skull-based neurosurgery. No sound came out of her mouth. The oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. My father, a man who had never in his life been in a room where he didn't hold all the leverage, realized in a single, shattering, devastating second that the only person on earth who could save his life was the man he had paid to leave his daughter. Julian did not smile. He did not cross his arms. He did not mention the checkbook, the study, the wedding they had boycotted, or the 6 years of deafening silence. He simply tapped the screen of his iPad, pulled up the brightly colored 3D rendering of my father's brain, and began explaining the tumor margins. He was entirely, devastatingly professional. He spoke about vascular adherence, optic nerve preservation, and tissue resection with the calm, measured rhythmic cadence of a master mechanic explaining a complex engine failure. He did not treat my father like a monster. He treated him like a patient. And somehow, that absolute neutrality was the most crushing response possible. My father stared at him. His hands, resting weakly on his knees, began to shake. A fine, uncontrollable tremor of pure shock. "You," my father whispered. The word barely had breath behind it, scraping against his throat. "You're the specialist. You're Dr. Hayes." "I am," Julian said evenly, not looking up from the scans. "And the procedure is extremely high risk. The mortality rate for this specific resection is significant, but I have performed the modified technique successfully 12 times. You are a candidate." My mother broke the silence. Unable to sit in the discomfort of her own past cruelty, she defaulted to her only known strategy. She tried to violently renegotiate reality to protect her ego. "Well," she said, her voice tight, artificially high-pitched, desperately attempting to sound like a gracious, loving matriarch, rather than a hostage to biology. "Well, of course, Julian. We're family. We knew you'd take care of us. We've always known you were destined for great things." It was a lie so transparent, so fundamentally pathetic, that it hung in the sterile hospital air like bad perfume. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. I walked over and stood right beside Julian. My parents looked at me. The daughter they had intentionally erased. The daughter they had written off as a failed, depreciating investment. I didn't perform for them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer them the dramatic, tearful reconciliation they suddenly, desperately needed to feel safe. "You aren't family," I said quietly, my voice steady. "You made that very clear 6 years ago. You formalized it in writing. You don't get to claim him now just because you're scared." My mother flinched as if she had been struck. "But Julian is a professional," I continued, looking directly at my father, "and he takes care of his patients, regardless of who they are, regardless of what they've done." My father looked at me. He really looked at me, stripping away the spreadsheets and the expectations. And for the first time in my 32 years of life, I saw the exact, precise moment his leverage broke into a million unfixable pieces. He had nothing to trade. He had no money that mattered. No threats that carried weight. No inheritance left to dangle over my head. All of his wealth, all of his terrifying power, had been reduced to the size of a walnut pressing against his optic nerve. He was entirely, helplessly dependent on the hope that the man he despised was a much better person than he was. Julian performed the surgery 3 weeks later. It was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The procedure took 11.5 agonizing hours. I sat in the surgical waiting room for the entire duration. I didn't sit with my mother, who occupied a corner leather couch, making hushed, frantic phone calls to her country club friends, narrating the tragedy as if it were a play happening exclusively to her. I sat alone by the window, watching the traffic move far below. I wasn't in that waiting room because I was worried about the man bleeding on the operating table. I was there because I was holding space for the man holding the scalpel. I was anchoring Julian, knowing the immense physical and psychological toll he was paying to save the life of a man who had treated him like garbage. Finally, at 7:40 p.m., the heavy double doors of the surgical wing hissed open. Julian walked out. He was still in his blue scrubs, his surgical cap pulled low over his forehead. He looked hollowed out, carrying the specific, bone-deep fatigue that only comes from holding a human life in your hands for half a day. He walked over to where my mother was sitting. I stood up and joined them. "The tumor is completely resected," Julian said, his voice hoarse and dry. "We preserved the optic nerve entirely. He had no strokes on the table. It was close, but he is going to live." My mother let out a loud, theatrical sob. She reached out with both arms, trying to pull Julian into an embrace, trying to claim him as her son, trying to instantly wash away 6 years of cruelty with one hug. Julian took a polite, very firm step backward, keeping his hands at his sides. "The surgical ICU nurses will take you back to see him in about an hour," Julian said clinically. He didn't wait for her response. He turned, took my hand, and we walked silently down the long hallway toward the elevators. 2 days later, my father woke up. He was extubated, incredibly weak, and highly medicated, but his cognitive function was miraculously intact. The first thing he did was ask the ICU nurse to find me. I went up to the intensive care unit. I stood at the foot of his bed, listening to the rhythmic, synthetic beeping of the life support monitors. My father looked incredibly old. He looked frail, stripped of the expensive suits, the booming voice, and the intimidating mythology he had spent a lifetime building around himself. He looked at me through half-open eyes, and he immediately tried to do the only thing he knew how to do to fix a problem. He tried to initiate a transaction. His voice was a weak rasp. He offered to reinstate my trust fund with interest. He offered to buy Julian a private practice building outright, in cash. He offered to call his lawyers that afternoon and put us back in his will as the primary beneficiaries. He was frantically trying to pay off a debt that could not be quantified in dollars. He was panicking because he did not know how to exist in a universe where he owed his very life to someone he could not control, purchase, or manipulate. I looked at the man who had traded his own daughter away for not following his business plan. "Keep your money, Dad," I said. It was the exact same sentence Julian had used in the study 6 years ago, but this time, lying in a hospital bed, my father finally understood the currency we were dealing in. I didn't say it with anger. I didn't say it with malice or a desire to wound him. I said it with the quiet, unshakable, bulletproof satisfaction of someone who had built a beautiful life that simply didn't need his funding to survive. I turned around, walked out of the ICU, and I never went back to that hospital to check on him again. There is a pervasive myth we are constantly fed about family and forgiveness. We are told that a sudden brush with death magically fixes everything. That tragedy acts like a reset button, washing away the painful past, erasing the cruelty, and leaving everyone in the room suddenly grateful, permanently changed, and bound together by the sheer miracle of survival. That is a really nice story. It makes for heartwarming movies and easy conclusions. But it is rarely the actual truth. The truth is that my parents did not wake up and suddenly respect Julian and me. They did not suddenly understand the deep value of our love, or feel genuine remorse for the extreme cruelty of their actions. They just needed us. And you have to learn this lesson if you want to protect your peace. Needing someone is not the same thing as loving them. Dependence is not respect. Julian and I went home that evening to the modest house we had bought with our own money. We went back to the dog we adopted, to the quiet routines we built together, and to the profound peace of knowing that our worth was never, ever determined by their validation. We had survived the extraction. Not just the physical extraction of my father's tumor, but the much harder emotional extraction of their conditional love from our lives. I want to tell you this story because I think we far too often underestimate the absolute power of simply refusing to play the game. Your value as a human being is not defined by the people who cannot afford your spirit. Your worth is not measured by the people who require you to shrink, to compromise your joy, or to abandon your chosen family just to earn a crumb of their approval. Your value is built by your own hands. It is built day by day, choice by choice, in the silent, invisible, unglamorous work of becoming exactly who you are meant to be. If you have ever had to push your chair back and walk away from a table where love was conditional, let this story be your sign to keep walking forward. Do not go back just because they finally realized what they lost. Do not let them buy back the peace you worked so hard to build. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this specific truth today. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to build your own family from scratch, using entirely different materials than the broken ones you were handed? How did you find your peace? Hit subscribe so you never miss a story, and I will see you in the next one. Remember, your story is yours to write. Don't let anyone else hold the pen. Thank you for sitting with me in it.